Happy Tuesday from Bill. Thanks for tuning in on this fine Tuesday morning. Or afternoon, depending on where you are, I reckon. I'm in the South, so I'm assuming by the time my grandson posts this for me, it'll be sometime in the morning. I see him giving me the signal to quit talking and get on with it. But I'm old now, and I've spent most of my life being told what to do. My wife does enough of that. I'm kidding. Anyhow, this is Great American Classics. We're talking about one of the strangest and most fascinating weapons of the Second World War, a wooden aircraft armed with a tank gun that hunted German submarines across the Bay of Biscay. It's called the Mosquito FB Mark 18. But the men who flew it had another name for it. They called it the tsetse, after the African fly whose bite could kill cattle. This aircraft had a bite that could kill submarines. Fewer than 30 were ever built, and most people have never heard of it. But the tsetse represents one of the boldest experiments in aviation history, a desperate attempt to solve a deadly problem that was costing the Allies thousands of lives and threatening to strangle Britain into submission. So let's take a look back at how this remarkable weapon came to be, how it was used, and what it accomplished in the final years of the war. This is a story about innovation under pressure, about engineers and pilots who refused to accept that a problem had no solution, and about a handful of aircraft that made a difference out of all proportion to their numbers. It's also a story about the kind of thinking that can emerge when a nation's survival is at stake, when the old ways aren't working, and when someone has the courage to try something that sounds completely crazy. To understand why anyone would put a tank gun on an airplane, you first have to understand what was happening in the North Atlantic in 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the entire war, stretching from the first day to the last, and by the spring of that year, its outcome was still very much in doubt. It was a campaign that got less attention than the great land battles, less coverage than the bombing offensive against Germany, but it was arguably the most important campaign of the entire war. Everything else depended on it. Without victory in the Atlantic, there could be no invasion of Europe, no liberation of France, no final defeat of Nazi Germany. German submarines, the infamous U-boats, were sinking Allied shipping at a staggering rate. In March 1943 alone, U-boats sank over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping, more than 100 vessels sent to the bottom of the Atlantic along with their cargoes and crews. That single month represented the highest losses of the entire war, a crisis point that had the Allied commanders genuinely frightened. If the rate of sinkings continued, if the Germans could maintain this pace of destruction, the war in Europe might be lost before it had really begun. Britain depended on convoys from North America for food, fuel, ammunition, and everything else needed to keep fighting. The country imported more than half its food, nearly all of its oil, and vast quantities of raw materials and finished goods from overseas. Every freighter that went down meant the lifeline of the nation was being cut, thread by thread. The country was an island, and islands can be starved. This was not a theoretical concern. Rationing was already severe. Civilians were living on reduced rations of meat, butter, sugar, and other staples. Industry was struggling to obtain the raw materials needed to maintain war production, and the losses at sea were mounting, threatening to outpace the rate at which new ships could be built. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The German submarine campaign came closer to defeating Britain than any other Axis weapon, closer than the Luftwaffe had come during the Blitz, closer than the V-1s and V-2s would come later. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, if they could cut the supply lines that connected Britain to the industrial might of North America, then the war in Europe might be lost before the first Allied soldiers set foot in France. The stakes could not have been higher. The human cost of the submarine war was staggering. More than 30,000 Allied merchant sailors died in the Battle of the Atlantic, their ships torpedoed without warning in the darkness of night, their bodies lost in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where rescue was often impossible. For every U-boat sunk, dozens of merchant ships went down, their cargoes lost, their crews drowned or frozen in lifeboats that might drift for days before rescue arrived, if rescue came at all. The men who sailed those convoys knew the risks they faced. They signed on anyway, because the supplies had to get through, because Britain would starve without them, because someone had to do the job. This was not lost on the Germans either. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, understood perfectly well that the submarine war was Germany's best chance of victory. His strategy was simple, but devastating. Attack the merchant ships. Sink more tonnage than the Allies could replace. Starve Britain into submission, or at least into a negotiated peace. Germany could not match the combined industrial power of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union in a prolonged war. But if the U-boats could cut the sea lanes, if they could isolate Britain from its sources of supply, then industrial power would not matter. You cannot fight a war with factories that have no raw materials. By 1943, Donitz had more than 400 submarines under his command, the largest fleet ever assembled. They hunted in wolf packs, groups of submarines that would locate a convoy and converge on it from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts and sinking ship after ship before dispersing back into the vastness of the Atlantic. The tactics were brutally effective. A wolf pack attack on a convoy could sink a dozen ships in a single night, sending thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of sailors to the bottom. The wolf pack tactic exploited the fundamental weakness of the convoy system. A convoy could only travel as fast as its slowest ship, usually about 8 or 9 knots. The escort vessels could protect the flanks and the rear, but they could not be everywhere at once. A single U-boat might shadow a convoy for days, radioing its position to headquarters, while other submarines converged from across the Atlantic. When enough boats had gathered, they would attack together, from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts with the sheer number of torpedoes in the water. The escorts would race from one attack to another, dropping depth charges and hunting contacts. But while they chased one submarine, others were torpedoing ships on the other side of the convoy. It was a battle of mathematics as much as tactics, and the numbers often favored the submarines. The escorts might sink 1 or 2 U-boats, but they could not prevent the wolf pack from savaging the convoy first. The Allies had developed various methods to fight back against the submarine menace. Convoys grouped merchant ships together so they could be protected by escort vessels. The convoy system reduced losses dramatically compared to ships sailing alone, but it could not eliminate them entirely. Escort vessels, destroyers, corvettes, and frigates hunted submarines with sonar and attacked them with depth charges, explosive canisters set to detonate at predetermined depths. This was painstaking work, requiring skill, patience, and no small amount of luck. A submarine that was detected had a fighting chance of escaping, maneuvering in 3 dimensions, while the surface ship could only drop its charges and hope. Long-range patrol aircraft like the Consolidated Liberator and the short Sunderland flying boat could spot submarines on the surface from miles away, forcing them to dive and lose precious time. The aircraft could not always sink the submarines they spotted, but they could keep them underwater, where they were slow, blind, and burning through their limited battery power. Every hour a submarine spent submerged was an hour it could not be hunting convoys. Radar sets allowed aircraft to detect surfaced submarines even at night or in poor visibility, taking away the cover of darkness that the U-boats had relied upon. New weapons were being developed constantly. Rockets could be fired from aircraft against surfaced submarines, delivering a heavier punch than machine guns or cannon fire. Acoustic homing torpedoes, nicknamed Fido or Mark 24 Mine, to confuse the Germans about what they actually were, could chase a submerged submarine by following the sound of its propellers. These were remarkable weapons, essentially underwater guided missiles, though their effectiveness was limited by range and speed. Depth charges were improved with more powerful explosives and better fuses, including magnetic proximity fuses that could detonate when they sensed the metal hull of a submarine nearby. The technology of submarine warfare was advancing on both sides, a deadly race between the hunters and the hunted. But there was a fundamental problem that none of these solutions fully addressed, and that problem was speed. The window of vulnerability for a submarine on the surface was measured in seconds, not minutes. A U-boat caught on the surface was vulnerable, but only for a very short time. The moment a German commander spotted an aircraft, he would order a crash dive, and a well-trained crew could get their submarine beneath the waves in under a minute, sometimes in as little as 25 seconds. The dive sequence was practiced until it became automatic. The lookouts would spot the aircraft, the alarm would sound, the diesels would be shut down, the hatches sealed, the ballast tanks flooded. Men would slide down ladders and throw themselves through narrow openings as the boat angled downward. Within half a minute, the submarine could be 50 feet underwater, below the effective range of most aerial weapons. Once submerged, the U-boat became almost impossible to hit. The submarine could maneuver in 3 dimensions, changing depth and direction while the aircraft above could only guess where it had gone. Water is an effective shield against most weapons. Even a near miss with a depth charge might do nothing more than rattle the crew and shake loose some fittings. To sink a submarine with depth charges required either a direct hit or an explosion close enough to rupture the pressure hull. And that meant knowing almost exactly where the submarine was at the moment of detonation. Depth charges had to be dropped with precise timing and positioning, and even a few seconds of error could mean the difference between a kill and a miss. A submarine that dove to 300 feet was relatively safe from most aerial weapons. The aircraft above might circle for hours, dropping depth charges or sono buoys, but without knowing exactly where the U-boat was, it could not deliver a killing blow. The submarine could sit quietly on the bottom or creep away at its slowest speed, waiting for the aircraft to run low on fuel and depart. Patience was a submarine's greatest ally, and Allied aircraft could not hover indefinitely over a patch of ocean waiting for their quarry to reappear. Rockets were another option, but they had their own limitations. The standard British rocket projectile of 1943 was the RP-3, a simple unguided weapon with a 60-pound high-explosive warhead. It was devastating against surface ships when it hit, capable of penetrating hulls and starting fires that could doom a vessel. But accuracy was a serious problem. Rockets scattered across a wide pattern affected by crosswinds, by slight variations in launch velocity, by imperfections in manufacture. Hitting a relatively small target like a submarine's conning tower required luck as much as skill. Training records showed that pilots achieved only about 5% accuracy with rockets against tank-sized targets, which meant that out of 8 rockets, a pilot might expect less than 1 to hit. Many attacks would miss entirely, the rockets splashing harmlessly into the sea while the submarine dove to safety. Even when rockets did hit, the damage was not always fatal. A submarine's pressure hull was thick steel, designed to withstand the enormous pressures of deep ocean diving. A rocket that struck the outer casing might destroy equipment, kill sailors on deck, even start fires, but it might not prevent the submarine from diving. And once the submarine was underwater, the attack was essentially over. The aircraft had missed its chance. Bombs were even more problematic. A direct bombing run against a submarine required the aircraft to fly straight and level for an extended period, giving the U-boat's gunners a clear shot and giving the submarine's commander time to dive. The approach had to be precise, the altitude had to be correct, the airspeed had to be exact. The bomb had to be released at precisely the right moment to hit a target that was already moving and probably already descending. Misses were common, and even near misses often failed to do significant damage to the heavily constructed pressure hull of a submarine. A bomb that exploded 50 feet away might do nothing at all. What the Allies needed was a weapon that could deliver an immediate, crippling blow in those brief, critical seconds before the submarine vanished beneath the waves. Something that could be aimed with precision and fired rapidly. Something that could penetrate the submarine's hull and make it impossible to dive. Something that worked in the gap between spotting the target and losing it, a gap that might be only 30 seconds wide. Engineers proposed something audacious. If the existing weapons were too slow or too inaccurate, why not use a gun? Not just any gun, but a very large gun, the kind used to knock out German tanks in North Africa. A gun did not require a bomb run. A gun could be fired the moment the target came into range. A gun delivered its projectile instantaneously, without the delay of a falling bomb or the uncertainty of an unguided rocket. And if the gun was large enough, powerful enough, a single hit might be sufficient to cripple a submarine before it could escape. The British 6-pounder was a 57mm anti-tank cannon that had already proven itself against German armor in the desert campaigns. Introduced in 1942, it had replaced the inadequate 2-pounder as the standard British anti-tank weapon, and it had performed admirably against Rommel's panzers at El Alamein and throughout the Tunisian campaign. The gun could penetrate over 3 inches of armor at close range, more than enough to punch through the pressure hull of any submarine. The 2-pounder, the previous British anti-tank gun, had proven embarrassingly ineffective against German tanks in the desert. It simply could not penetrate the armor of the newer German vehicles, and British tank crews and anti-tank gunners had paid the price. The 6-pounder changed that equation. At ranges under 1,000 yards, it could defeat any German tank then in service. It restored confidence to British anti-tank crews and gave the infantry a weapon they could trust. The problem was rate of fire. A standard 6-pounder required a crew of 5 or 6 men to load, aim, and fire, with a trained crew managing perhaps 15 rounds per minute. That was fine for a ground-mounted weapon engaging tanks where you might have time to observe your first shot, correct your aim, and fire again. But it was far too slow for an aircraft making a diving attack on a submarine. An aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour covers about 440 feet per second. In the time it took to load a round, the aircraft would travel a quarter mile, far past the point where accurate fire was possible. An aircraft-mounted gun had to fire much faster. The solution came from a company called Molins, specialists in machinery for the tobacco and packaging industries who had diversified into weapons production during the war. Molins had developed an automatic loading mechanism for the 6-pounder that could feed shells into the breech without human intervention. The modified weapon, designated the Molins gun, or the Class M 6-pounder, could fire rapidly in either semi-automatic or fully automatic mode. It held 25 rounds in its magazine, and a pilot could empty the entire load in a matter of seconds if he chose to. The automatic loader was an engineering achievement in itself. It had to handle heavy shells, cycle rapidly, and function reliably despite the vibration and maneuvering of a fast-moving aircraft. Malines solved these problems with the same precision engineering they applied to cigarette-making machines, adapting factory automation technology to the demands of aerial warfare. The result was a weapon that could fire 55 rounds per minute in automatic mode, nearly 4 times the rate of a manually loaded gun. The gun weighed about 715 kilograms, or roughly 1,580 pounds, with its mounting, ammunition, and automatic loading mechanism. Each 57mm shell weighed about 6 pounds, and the muzzle velocity was approximately 2,920 feet per second. At that speed, the shell would reach a target 1,000 yards away in about 1 second, fast enough that the pilot did not have to lead a moving target significantly. The trajectory was flat and predictable, making aiming straightforward compared to the complex calculations required for dropping bombs. It was a substantial addition to any aircraft, but it was not impossible to accommodate. The question was, what aircraft could carry such a weapon while still retaining the speed and maneuverability needed to hunt submarines? The aircraft had to be fast enough to catch a submarine before it dove, maneuverable enough to line up its shots, and strong enough to absorb the tremendous recoil of a large-caliber cannon firing repeatedly. The answer was the de Havilland Mosquito, already one of the most remarkable aircraft of the war. The Mosquito was unique in several ways. It was built almost entirely of wood, which sounds primitive but was actually a brilliant solution to wartime material shortages. Aluminum was desperately needed for other aircraft and was in short supply. Every pound of aluminum used for a bomber or fighter was a pound that could not be used for engine blocks, ammunition casings, or the 1,000 other demands of a mechanized war. Wood, particularly the high-quality birch and balsa used in the Mosquito's construction, was readily available and could be worked by furniture factories and cabinet makers rather than specialized aircraft plants. This distributed the manufacturing burden and freed up the aircraft industry to focus on the all-metal designs that required their specialized skills. The wooden construction was also lighter than metal for a given strength, giving the aircraft exceptional speed and range. The fuselage was a monocoque structure, meaning the skin carried the structural loads rather than an internal framework. It was made by gluing together layers of birch plywood and balsa wood, creating a structure that was both light and strong. The surface could be finished to an exceptional smoothness, reducing drag and adding to the aircraft's speed. When the prototype Mosquito first flew in November 1940, it achieved speeds that astonished everyone involved. The little wooden airplane was faster than the Spitfire, faster than any fighter in the Royal Air Force inventory at that time. It could outrun anything the Germans had, which meant it did not need defensive armament to survive. Where other bombers bristled with gun turrets manned by multiple gunners, the Mosquito carried only its 2-man crew, a pilot and a navigator, relying on speed rather than firepower to escape enemy interceptors. This radical design philosophy paid enormous dividends. A heavy bomber like the Lancaster or Halifax carried a crew of 7, including dedicated gunners for each turret. The weight of those gun positions, the ammunition, and the extra crew members reduced the bomb load and the range. The Mosquito carried no defensive armament at all in its bomber variants, which meant all of its payload capacity could be devoted to bombs. Pound for pound, it could deliver more explosives to a target than any other aircraft in the RAF. Pilots called it the Wooden Wonder, and it had already proven itself in multiple roles by 1943. As a bomber, it could carry 4,000 pounds of explosives to Berlin and back at speeds that made interception almost impossible. The Germans developed dedicated night fighter units specifically to combat the Mosquito, but they found it maddeningly difficult to catch. The wooden construction did not show up as clearly on radar as aluminum aircraft, adding a measure of stealth to its speed. As a night fighter, equipped with radar and cannons, the Mosquito had become the terror of German bomber crews over England. Its speed allowed it to climb quickly to intercept incoming raids, and its armament of 4 20mm cannon and 4 .303 caliber machine guns gave it the firepower to destroy any aircraft with a single burst. The radar operator in the back seat guided the pilot to within visual range, and then the pilot took over for the kill. As a reconnaissance aircraft, flying at high altitude with cameras instead of bombs, the Mosquito photographed targets across occupied Europe with impunity. It could fly higher and faster than the German interceptors sent to bring it down, returning with vital intelligence about enemy defenses, industrial facilities, and troop movements. As a pathfinder for Bomber Command, it marked targets with flares and incendiaries so that the heavy bombers following behind would know where to drop their loads. The pathfinders had to reach the target first, identify it accurately, and mark it clearly, all while German night fighters and flak guns tried to bring them down. Speed and maneuverability were essential for survival, and the Mosquito had both. Its twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants that made the Spitfire and Hurricane famous, gave it the thrust to carry heavy loads at high speeds. The Merlin was arguably the most successful aircraft engine of the war, a supercharged V-12 that combined reliability with power. In the Mosquito, 2 of these engines produced over 3,000 horsepower, enough to push the wooden aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. Its strong but lightweight wooden frame made it adaptable to almost any mission. The Mosquito was, quite simply, one of the finest aircraft ever built, and it was about to be adapted for yet another role, one that its designers had never imagined. The idea of fitting a large caliber gun to the Mosquito was not entirely new. The aircraft had already been used with 57mm guns in the anti-tank role, though with limited success. The original plan for the Malines-armed Mosquito was to create a tank buster that could destroy German armor in support of ground forces. Experiments had been conducted, prototypes built, and tactics developed. But by 1943, the tactical situation had changed. The Hawker Typhoon, with its rockets and bombs, was proving effective against tanks. The rocket projectiles could be fired from a diving approach, saturating an area with explosives and destroying multiple vehicles in a single pass. More importantly, Coastal Command desperately needed a weapon that could stop U-boats in their tracks, and the Molins gun seemed ideally suited to that purpose. The anti-shipping role was in some ways more demanding than the anti-tank role. Submarines were smaller than tanks and could dive out of sight in seconds. Ships at sea presented a constantly moving target in 3 dimensions, pitching and rolling in the waves, and the enemy was not passive. U-boats by 1943 were heavily armed with anti-aircraft weapons, and their crews were trained to fight back against attacking aircraft. An anti-shipping aircraft had to be fast, accurate, and tough enough to survive enemy fire. The Mosquito met all of these requirements. In mid-1943, engineers fitted a crashed Mosquito fuselage with a 6-pounder field artillery gun to prove the concept was feasible. The tests were successful. The wooden structure could withstand the recoil of the cannon, absorbing and distributing the shock without cracking or distorting. The gun could be aimed and fired accurately from the aircraft, the pilot using his normal gun sight and firing controls. The Royal Air Force authorized the conversion of a small number of Mosquito FB Mark VI fighter bombers to carry the massive Molins cannon. The result was designated the Mosquito FB Mark XVIII. The conversion was not simple and required substantial modification to the aircraft. The four 20mm Hispano cannons that normally armed the fighter bomber were removed, creating space in the forward fuselage for the much larger Mollins gun. The 57mm cannon was installed in their place, its long barrel projecting from the nose, and its automatic loading mechanism filling the area where the smaller guns had been. The entire weapon installation weighed about 1,580 pounds, including the gun, the automatic loader, the mounting, and the 25 rounds of ammunition. To protect the crew from the heavily armed U-boats they would be attacking, engineers added approximately 900 pounds of steel armor around the nose, within the engine cowlings, and under the cockpit floor. This armor was not enough to stop a direct hit from a 37mm shell, but it would deflect smaller caliber rounds and fragments, giving the crew a better chance of surviving the approach run. U-boats by 1943 were not defenseless targets. They carried multiple anti-aircraft guns, typically a combination of 20mm and 37mm cannons, that could fill the sky with explosive shells. The 20mm guns fired at a high rate, putting up a wall of tracers that any attacking aircraft had to fly through. The 37mm guns were slower but more powerful, capable of destroying an aircraft with a single hit. Any aircraft making a low-level attack on a surfaced submarine was going to take fire, and the crew needed protection. 2 or 4 of the original .303 caliber Browning machine guns were retained in the nose. These were not primarily offensive weapons. Their purpose was to help the pilot aim the big gun. The tracer rounds from the machine guns would show where the cannon shells would hit, allowing the pilot to adjust his aim before firing the main weapon. It was a simple but effective solution to the problem of aiming a large caliber gun from a fast-moving aircraft. The pilot would fire a short burst from the machine guns, observe where the tracers struck, and then open fire with the cannon, confident that his shells would hit the same spot. The aircraft that emerged from these modifications looked different from any other Mosquito. The nose was dominated by the long barrel of the 57mm cannon, projecting forward in a way that gave the aircraft an almost brutish appearance. Where the standard Mosquito had a sleek, aerodynamic nose designed to minimize drag, the XVIII had something that looked more like a warship's gun turret grafted onto an airplane. Ground crews who saw it for the first time understood immediately that this was something new, something designed for a very specific and very violent purpose. The nickname tsetse stuck almost immediately. The tsetse fly is a blood-sucking insect native to Africa, famous for transmitting sleeping sickness to cattle and humans. Its bite is small but deadly, capable of killing animals many times its size. The analogy was perfect for this new Mosquito variant, a rare predator with a lethal sting, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage despite its relatively small numbers. Only about 18 to 27 tsetses were ever built, depending on how you count the various conversions and prototypes. But each one carried a weapon that could cripple a submarine with a single well-placed hit. The first tsetses were delivered to 248 Squadron of RAF Coastal Command in late 1943. The initial aircraft, numbered HX-902 through HX-904, arrived in October and were quickly put to work. The squadron was based at Prydanek in Cornwall, on the southwestern tip of England, perfectly positioned for patrols over the Bay of Biscay. Later, they would move to Portreath, also in Cornwall, continuing their operations against German shipping and submarines. The Bay of Biscay was one of the most dangerous hunting grounds of the war for both sides. This narrow stretch of water between France and Spain was the gateway to the Atlantic for German submarines. U-boats leaving their bases at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire had to cross the bay to reach the open ocean. It was a bottleneck, a choke point where submarines were concentrated and vulnerable. For Coastal Command, The bay was a killing ground where submarines could be caught in the open before they disappeared into the vastness of the Atlantic. The Germans knew this, of course, and they took elaborate precautions. U-boats often traveled in groups for mutual protection, escorted by armed trawlers and minesweepers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. These escort vessels were specifically designed to protect submarines during the dangerous transit through the bay, and they took their job seriously. The Luftwaffe provided fighter cover as well. Junkers 88s patrolling over the bay to intercept Allied aircraft that strayed too close to the submarine routes. The battles over the Bay of Biscay were some of the most intense of the entire war, a constant struggle between Coastal Command and the German defenders. The crews of 248 Squadron were veterans of these dangerous patrols, experienced in hunting submarines and fighting off the German fighters that protected them. They had flown Bristol Beaufighters before transitioning to the Mosquito in late 1943, and they knew the bay intimately, its weather patterns, its currents, the routes the U-boats preferred, the locations where they were most likely to be found. They were exactly the kind of experienced crews needed to test this experimental new weapon in combat. Operations with the XVIII began on October 24, 1943. The first attack on a U-boat came on November 7th, when a XVIII engaged a submarine with its cannon. The results were promising but not decisive. The shells struck the submarine's conning tower, causing visible damage, but the U-boat managed to dive and escape before the attack could be pressed home. Still, the concept had been proven. The gun worked. The aircraft could deliver it to the target. What remained was to refine the tactics and demonstrate that the XVIII could actually sink submarines. Pilots discovered that the XVIII handled differently from the standard Mosquito. It was still fast, capable of speeds over 300 miles per hour, and reasonably agile despite the weight of the cannon and armor. The center of gravity had shifted forward with the heavy gun installation, which affected the aircraft's handling characteristics. But experienced pilots adapted quickly. But the recoil from the gun was tremendous. When the 57mm cannon fired, the entire aircraft shuddered. Pilots described the sensation as being kicked in the chest by a mule. The nose would dip with each shot, and pilots had to compensate constantly to keep the target in their sights. The automatic loader was reliable, but not instantaneous. There was a brief pause between shots as the mechanism cycled, feeding the next round into the breech. In fully automatic mode, the gun could fire perhaps 55 to 60 rounds per minute, which sounds fast until you realize that each shot had to count. 25 rounds was not a lot of ammunition when you were attacking a maneuvering target that was shooting back at you. A pilot who fired wildly, hoping to score lucky hits, would empty his magazine in seconds and have nothing left for a second pass. The attack profile was also demanding. To hit a submarine with the cannon, pilots had to start from about 5,000 feet, dive at approximately 30 degrees, and hold a steady course until they were within effective range, about 1,800 yards or roughly a mile. This meant flying straight and level toward a target that was shooting back, often for 15 to 20 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. Any deviation from the approach would throw off the aim. Any evasive maneuver would waste precious seconds and ammunition. The pilot had to commit to the attack and hold his nerve through a storm of tracer fire and flak bursts. The gunners on U-boats were not helpless. By 1943, submarines had been fitted with increasingly powerful anti-aircraft weapons, a response to the growing threat from aircraft. A surfaced U-boat typically mounted a platform called a Wintergarten behind the conning tower, equipped with multiple 20mm guns that could put up a wall of lead. Some boats carried 37mm weapons as well, heavier guns that could do serious damage to an attacking aircraft. The German commanders had learned that diving was not always the safest option when aircraft appeared. Sometimes it was better to stay on the surface and fight, trusting to the flak to drive off the attackers while the submarine maneuvered to avoid bombs and depth charges. This tactic, called standing and fighting, had proven effective against slower patrol aircraft. Against XVIII, it was a dangerous gamble, but German commanders did not always know what kind of aircraft they were facing until it was too late. The armor on the XVIII helped protect the crew, but there was no way to make the approach run truly safe. Pilots accepted that they would take hits. They trusted their armor to stop the smaller caliber rounds, and they hoped that luck would keep the larger shells away from anything vital. Every attack required nerve, precision, and a willingness to fly into enemy fire while holding a steady course. It was not a job for the faint-hearted. The payoff for all this risk was the devastating effect of the 57mm shells. Unlike rockets, which scattered across a pattern and might miss entirely, the cannon shells went exactly where the pilot aimed them. The tracer machine guns helped ensure that the first cannon rounds would be on target, and a skilled pilot could walk his fire across a submarine's hull with deadly precision. Each shell weighed about 6 pounds and traveled at a muzzle velocity of nearly 2,920 feet per second, or about 890 meters per second. Tests showed that the shells could penetrate a submarine's pressure hull even when striking at an angle of 45 degrees through 2 feet of water. A single hit could rupture the hull, making it impossible for the submarine to dive. Multiple hits could destroy critical systems, kill crew members, flood compartments, and turn a seaworthy vessel into a sinking wreck in a matter of seconds. Training records showed that pilots achieved a hit rate of about 33% against tank-sized targets, which was vastly better than the 5% accuracy typically achieved with rocket projectiles. This meant that out of 25 rounds, a skilled pilot could expect to put 8 or 9 shells into a submarine, more than enough to cause catastrophic damage. For the first time, Coastal Command had a weapon that combined the range and speed of an aircraft with the precision and power of naval artillery. It was not quite a destroyer's deck gun, but it was close. The first confirmed kill by XVIII came on March 25, 1944. The target was U-976, a Type 7C submarine that had sailed from Saint-Nazaire on its way into the Atlantic. The Type 7C was the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, a medium-sized boat displacing about 770 tons on the surface, capable of diving to 230 meters and staying submerged for hours on its electric motors. More Type 7C boats were built than any other U-boat variant, and they bore the brunt of the Atlantic War on the German side. U-976 was on her first war patrol, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Raymond Tiesler, heading out into the Atlantic to join the Wolfpacks hunting Allied convoys. A strike force of 6 Mosquitoes from 248 Squadron, including 2 XVIIIs, spotted the submarine running on the surface southwest of Saint-Nazaire. The sea was choppy, the sky overcast. The submarine's crew had little choice but to remain exposed. Diesel-electric submarines of the Second World War spent most of their time on the surface. Their electric batteries had limited capacity, good for only a few hours of submerged running at slow speed. To recharge the batteries, to ventilate the boat and bring in fresh air for the crew, to make any speed toward their patrol areas, they had to surface and run on their diesel engines. For a submarine, the surface was both a necessity and a death trap. The XVIIIs dove in from altitude, their pilots beginning the attack run they had practiced so many times. German lookouts raised the alarm, and the flak guns barked to life. Tracers stitched the air around the attacking aircraft, orange and red lines reaching up toward the diving Mosquitoes. But the pilots pressed on, lining up the massive cannon on their target, squeezing the triggers of their machine guns to establish the aim before opening fire with the main weapon. The 57mm shells slammed into U-976's hull, tearing through the pressure casing and rupturing vital systems. Each impact sent a shower of steel fragments through the boat's interior. Pipes burst, compartments flooded. The submarine lurched as damage accumulated faster than the crew could react. The commander ordered a crash dive, the only hope of escape, but the damage was already too severe. Flooding compartments made it impossible to control the boat. The valves would not seal. The pumps could not keep up with the water pouring in. U-976 was trapped on the surface, helpless against the follow-up attacks from the rocket-armed Mosquitoes that accompanied the XVIIIs. The standard Mosquito FB Mark VIs swept in, their rockets tearing into the crippled submarine with devastating effect. Explosions ripped across the deck. Flames erupted from ruptured fuel tanks. Men scrambled to abandon ship, leaping into the cold Atlantic waters as their submarine began its final dive. U-976 went down with 4 of her crew. 49 survivors were pulled from the water, rescued by German vessels that arrived too late to save the boat, but in time to save most of her men. For the RAF, it was exactly what the XVIII had been designed to do: catch a submarine in the critical seconds when it was exposed, deliver an immediate crippling blow, and hold it vulnerable for the kill. The combination of cannon and rockets had worked perfectly. The XVIII disabled the target, and the supporting aircraft finished it off. More engagements followed over the spring and summer of 1944 as the XVIII proved itself in combat. On March 10, a strike force including XVIIIs attacked a German convoy consisting of a U-boat and 4 destroyers, escorted by 10 Junkers 88 fighters. It was exactly the kind of heavily defended target that made Bay of Biscay operations so dangerous. A nest of anti-aircraft guns protected by some of the best pilots the Luftwaffe could put in the air. The RAF formation consisted of aircraft from 248 Squadron, and they went in hard despite the odds. The Junkers 88s dove to intercept, and a swirling dogfight developed over the convoy. 3 of the German aircraft were shot down, including 1 destroyed in a remarkable manner by a single shell from a XVII's cannon. The pilot, Tony Phillips, found a Junkers 88 crossing in front of his aircraft and instinctively squeezed the trigger. The 57mm cannon spoke, and the massive shell tore into the German bomber with catastrophic effect. 1 round tore an engine clean off the wing, and the Junkers 88 went down in flames. It was an extraordinary feat that demonstrated the XVII's versatility and the deadliness of its armament, even against aircraft. The tactical approach that proved most effective was the strike wing, a coordinated formation of different Mosquito variants working together. Standard Mosquito FB Mark VIs carried rockets and provided fighter escort. The XVIIs delivered precision fire to disable targets and suppress defensive weapons. The combination was devastating, far more effective than either variant operating alone. The XVIII would attack first, diving in from altitude while the standard Mosquitoes held back. Its cannon shells would smash into the submarine or escort vessel with surgical accuracy, disabling gun positions, rupturing hulls, killing gunners before they could respond. Then, the rocket-armed Mosquitoes would sweep in to deliver the finishing blow, their salvos hammering the crippled target until it sank or burned. By June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, the XVIIs were heavily engaged in operations to protect the invasion fleet from U-boat attacks. They damaged U-212 on D-Day itself, June 6th. On June 10, they caught U-281 on the surface and subjected it to such intense attack that the crew abandoned ship. The submarine was later finished off by a Liberator bomber from 206 Squadron, but it was the XVIII that had made the kill possible. German accounts from survivors reveal the psychological impact of facing the XVIII. Sailors described the terror of seeing a Mosquito with a single giant barrel protruding from its nose, diving toward them at high speed. They knew that rockets might miss, but the XVIII's gun rarely did. The giant gun Mosquito, as some called it, became a source of dread along the French coast. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the balance of power in the Atlantic shifted decisively against the Germans. The liberation of France deprived the submarines of their Atlantic bases, forcing them to operate from Norway instead. In September 1944, 248 Squadron moved to Banff in Scotland to join the Banff Strike Wing, which targeted German shipping off the Norwegian coast. The XVIII's continued to serve, but their moment of greatest importance had passed. The final notable action for the XVIII's came on April 5, 1945, when a formation attacked 5 German surface ships in the Kattegat. The XVIII's set all 5 vessels on fire and sank them, including a sparebreaker that went down with all hands. It was a fitting end to the operational career of this remarkable weapon. By the end of the war, the surviving XVIII's were quietly retired. They had been an experiment, a bold idea tested in the crucible of combat, and while they were too few to change the course of the war alone, their story represents something important about innovation under pressure. A wooden airplane carrying a gun the size of an artillery piece proved that ingenuity could be as decisive as numbers. Today, no complete XVIII survives. What remains are photographs, documents, and the memories of those who flew them. The XVIII is remembered not for how many were built, but for what it represented. The willingness to try something different, to take risks, and to turn unlikely ideas into weapons of war. In the long history of the de Havilland Mosquito, the XVIII stands apart. It was a rare predator, built in small numbers, but feared out of all proportion to its rarity. Every U-boat commander who surfaced in the Bay of Biscay in 1944 knew that somewhere above the clouds there might be a Mosquito with a cannon in its nose, waiting for the moment when he was most vulnerable. That knowledge was itself a weapon, forcing caution on an enemy who could afford no caution, adding one more burden to crews already pushed beyond endurance. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by many things. It was won by codebreakers at Bletchley Park who cracked the Enigma cipher and read German communications, knowing where the wolf packs would strike before they arrived. It was won by radar operators who spotted submarines in the dark, taking away the cover of night that had made the U-boats so deadly. It was won by escort commanders who organized convoys and hunted down attackers with depth charges and hedgehog mortars. It was won by convoy captains who shepherded their ships through U-boat-infested waters, zigzagging through the night while torpedoes streaked past in the darkness. It was won by ordinary sailors who endured the terrors of the submarine war day after day, never knowing when a torpedo might send their ship to the bottom, standing watch on frozen decks while their cargo holds filled with the supplies that kept Britain alive. But it was also won by imagination, by the willingness to try new approaches when old ones failed. The XVIII was one small part of that effort, a handful of aircraft with an enormous gun, carrying the fight to the enemy in ways that no one had attempted before. It was an experiment born of desperation, refined through combat, and retired when the crisis had passed. But for a few crucial months in 1944, it made a difference. The legacy of the XVIII lives on in unexpected ways. Modern anti-ship missiles owe something to the concept, the idea that a single, precise hit can be more effective than multiple imprecise ones. The A-10 Thunderbolt, the American close air support aircraft with its massive 30mm Gatling gun, carries an echo of the XVIII's philosophy. The idea that an aircraft can serve as a flying artillery piece, delivering direct fire against point targets. The concept was validated over the Bay of Biscay in 1944 and has been refined ever since. The Mosquito itself went on to serve for years after the war, flying with air forces around the world until the last one was retired in the 1950s. It remains one of the most celebrated aircraft in aviation history, a testament to innovative design and the vision of the engineers at de Havilland, who refused to accept that conventional wisdom was always correct. The wooden wonder proved that a different approach could succeed, that speed and agility could replace armor and firepower, that elegant design could overcome material shortages. The XVIII was the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a specialized weapon created for a specific purpose, elegant in its brutality, effective beyond what anyone had dared to hope. The men who created it and the men who flew it deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes in the history of aviation, but as examples of what human ingenuity can accomplish when the stakes are highest and failure is not an option. This has been another story from Great American Classics. Before we finish, it's worth taking a moment to remember the men who flew these remarkable aircraft over the Bay of Biscay and the waters of occupied Europe. They were young men, most of them, pilots and navigators who had mastered the Mosquito's demanding flight characteristics and then volunteered to fly an even more demanding variant into some of the most dangerous missions of the war. They faced flak ships and fighter escorts, submarines bristling with anti-aircraft guns, and weather that could kill as surely as any enemy. Some of these fellas didn't make it back home. The XVIII, don't know if I pronounced that right, the XVIII itself may have been an experiment, a footnote in the larger story of the war, but the courage of the men who flew it was real, and it mattered. They took risks that few others would have accepted, trusting in a weapon that had never been tried before. They did their duty, and they did it well, and they helped to win a war that might have been lost without them. Their sacrifice is not something we should ever forget, and their story still matters today. Thank you for listening.